Now that we have context on what OCAPI is and the differences between OCAPI and SCAPI, what the purpose of each is, how they are used, and what they can provide us, it's time to introduce a key topic, the client ID, also known as Client Application Identification. As the name suggests, Client Application Identification is a way for the OCAPI and SCAPI APIs to identify that the requests they receive are legitimate. In other words, all requests made to OCAPI must include a client ID in some form, an identifier. Currently, there are three possible ways to identify this client ID in the requests. 1. Authorization token. For requests that require an authorization token, the client ID is determined by that same token. You can see this in the OCAPI documentation. I'll leave it in the link. In summary, if the request includes an authorization token, the client ID is already present in that token. 2. URL parameter. Another way to specify the client ID is through a parameter in the URL of the request. 3. HTTP header XDW client ID. The third way would be to use an HTTP header called XDW client ID, where the value would be the identifier, i.e. the client ID. So we've seen that there are three possible ways to pass the client ID in our requests. Now, what happens if we include the client ID in two different ways in our request? For example, if we include it in the token and also pass it as a parameter, and they happen to have different values for the client ID, then which one takes precedence? Which one does OCAPI use for authentication? The precedence order is as follows. 1. First, the client ID from the authorization token is considered. 2. If we are not including a client ID in the token, the client ID passed as a URL parameter is used. 3. If not, then it looks for the client ID in the HTTP header XDW client ID. If the client ID is not sent in any of these three ways, the server will return a 400 bad request status. To create our client ID, it will be necessary to access the account manager. It is likely that your Salesforce Commerce Cloud user does not have the necessary privileges to access the account manager. And if you do have access, it is most likely limited to updating your account information and little else. Therefore, it is unlikely that you have a user role that allows you to create client IDs. However, I will show you the process of how to create a client ID so you can get an idea of what you will see in the Account Manager panel. When we create a new client ID, it asks us to provide a name. This name should be descriptive so that you can later locate it easily in the list of client IDs. It is important to keep everything well organized to know the purpose of each of these client IDs. Additionally, there is a description field that allows us to be more specific about the use of the client ID. We are also asked for a password. The client ID has a client secret, which serves as the password. Then we have a section for organizations. Imagine you work for multiple companies. Here, you would need to indicate which company or realm the client ID you just created corresponds to. Finally, there are the roles. A single client ID can be used to make requests against a development instance, a staging instance, a production instance, or sandboxes, as long as the appropriate roles are specified. Alternatively, you could have a client ID dedicated to development, another for staging, and another for production. This is something your project architect should define, setting the guidelines for how you organize client IDs and assign permissions. Best practices suggest having separate client IDs for each environment so that potential failures can be identified without affecting different environments or causing security issues. This is the minimum information necessary to make requests with OCAPI when creating a client ID. That said, it is likely that you do not have the necessary privileges to create a client ID. So the question is, how do we continue with this course? Since we will be doing practical exercises and you will need a client ID, Salesforce Commerce Cloud provides a generic client ID for all sandboxes. This client ID already exists by default, so you don't need to create it. The generic client ID is simply 20 consecutive A's, and the client secret is the same, 20 consecutive A's. This client ID only works with sandbox environments, so don't try to use it in primary instance environments, as it will not work. As we just saw, from the account manager, we can restrict the instance and the realm to which a client ID can access in its different requests to OCAPI. However, this does not mean that we have access to the entire OCAPI API just because we have the necessary permissions in the account manager for our instance or our realms. The way Salesforce operates is by providing the minimum possible permissions or privileges by default. As mentioned, a client ID has no privileges initially, unless it is specifically assigned which instance it can access. Well, there is another level of security found within the same instance, in the Business Manager, which we will look at next. In this section, we can specify which resources of the different APIs, such as the Shop API or the Data API, our client ID can access. That is, we can segment access and define for a particular site and for the Shop API which specific resources that client ID will be able to access. For example, we can configure it so that one resource is available only in read mode, while another is available in both read and write modes, or different combinations based on our needs. This is very important from a security standpoint because if we leave everything open by default, unexpected situations could occur. Someone could update information that they shouldn't, simply because the client ID has broad access to the different APIs. Therefore, the recommendation is to grant only the necessary permissions to the OCAPI API endpoints or resources that the client ID needs to operate. To conclude the topic of client IDs, it's also important to mention that it's a best practice for the different integrations in our application to use separate client IDs. For example, suppose we have a mobile application developed for Android that needs to make requests to OCAPI. Additionally, we have another mobile application for iOS devices that also needs to make requests to OCAPI, and both applications were developed by different development teams. You might think that using the same client ID could solve the situation, allowing both teams and both applications, Android and iOS, to access our Commerce Cloud. And yes, this could work. However, the recommended approach in this case, or similar scenarios, is to create separate client IDs, so each integration uses its own client ID. This way, if in the future we need to deactivate requests or retire the client ID for the Android application, we can do so without affecting the iOS application, and vice versa. Also, imagine a security issue is discovered in the Android application while the iOS app continues to work correctly. In this case, if we want to disable only the API requests from the Android app, the way to do it would be by having two separate client IDs, so we can deactivate one without impacting the other.